My talk today is entitled Hierarchical Motor Organization in Violin Performance, an Initial Study. And this is motivated as a test of the ideas put forward in my 2021 book, Focal Impulse Theory. Focal impulse theory formalizes very widespread intuitions among musicians about what it means to play in a meter. So for example, if you're in common time, you can feel the music in 2 or in 4. That's an option you've got. And it makes a difference, that choice, feeling it in 2, feeling it in 4, makes a difference how it feels to perform the music and how the music sounds when performed. So I argue in the book that performers are performing from beat to beat at some level, the half note or the quarter in the case of common time in 2 or 4, throwing their bodies into arcs of motion from beat to beat, with the motions for individual notes fitting into those larger arcs, being organized and influenced by them, that is, the larger arcs. Focal impulse theory is couched in informally phenomenological terms. It is not empirical. It does not specify how this motional organization takes place. It does reflect on some of the science behind it. It concludes that at slow rates of motion, these arcs of motion are almost certainly metaphorical, but argues that they may well be more than metaphors at normal to faster rates of motion. So this experiment is looking for evidence of a larger kind of hierarchical organization of motion beyond the individual notes as you're playing music. So there's plenty of background for this, of course, precedents, especially the dynamic attending theory of Jones and various collaborators. So although most presentations of dynamic attending theory mention that it's possible to focus attention on selectively one level or another, this is not the most developed aspect of the theory, and most experiments that touch on this aspect at all do so only peripherally, the main exception being the work of Martens from 2012. So in designing these experiments, we drew on work from the motor control literature, and specifically a series of papers from Dagmar Sternad's group. Now, they were looking at a very simple question of hierarchy. So in a cyclical motion, is the motion truly in its mode of organization cyclical, or is it simply a string of discrete motions? And in the Q&A, I'll be happy to talk more about how their experiments work. Ours were modeled on them pretty directly. So what we had violinists playing an electric violin, and we had them play along with the metronome. So the metronome is going ding, 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 and they're playing chukka, 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 chukka. So they're putting their downbeats in the lower half of the bow, downbeats together with the metronome tones, 2 notes per metronome tone, chukka, 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 chukka. Now, at some point, randomly, with respect to this metronome tone, they hear this interrupting signal. And when they hear this signal, the metronome then stops. And in response to the signal, they've been instructed to make a big down bow as quickly in response as possible, to go now to the lower part, sorry, to the upper part of the bow and continue moving, resume their previous motion. So chicka, 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 gong, chicka, 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 and they try and go as fast as possible and then resume that prior motion. Back to my slides. Here we go. Okay. So there were 3 experimental conditions. First, the 2-beat condition was just as I described. It's a simple 1-tone metronome. Every metronome tone is the same. The rate is 300 milliseconds for the IOIs of the metronome, so 150 milliseconds for each note. Again, downbeats, down bows correlated with the metronome tones. The 4-beat condition has tones from the metronome at the same rate, but now every other tone has been made more salient, and the performers are instructed to give attention to the longer beat duration, the 600 millisecond beat, as the main beat. They're not told to accent the main beat. They're not told to suppress, or they're told that they don't need to accent the main beat. They don't need to suppress an accent on the main beat. The main thing is just to feel that beat as the main beat and focus as they play the passage, either the 300 millisecond beat in the 2-beat condition or the 600 millisecond beat in the 4-beat condition. Now, by themselves, these 2 conditions are not going to get at what we were most interested in terms of organization of motion in the body, because a contrast between these 2 conditions could simply have arisen as a result of perceptual set or cognitive factors of various sorts. So we added a 3rd condition. The stimulus was essentially the same as in the 4-beat condition, except that now in response to that interrupting signal, they're told to make a verbal response saying ta. And I think I forgot to mention, after the interrupting signal, the metronome stops. So they're told to make a response as quickly as possible, then resume motion, but there's no more metronomes. They're on their own to pace that as it comes, basically. Okay, so a few things about details about the experiment. There were 11 participants, ages 19 to 29, mean of 18 years training in violin and or viola. For each task condition, there were 2 blocks of 6 trials each, so to provide a little rest in between, kind of a high concentration but also boring task. And I'm happy to discuss outlying data that's not included here and data processing in the Q&A for time's sake. Okay, so I'm going to go through hypothesis by hypothesis and discuss results as we go, again, for time's sake. So first hypothesis is very simple, that there would be significant entrainment between the previously established metronomic pulse and the response to the interrupting signal in both the 2-beat and 4-beat conditions. Okay, so when that big, they hear the gong and they're told as quickly as you can, make that big down bow, but that there's going to be a lot of phase capture between the previously established metronomic motion and that new interrupting motion. Okay, so here's what our data looks like for the 2-beat and the 4-beat condition. So to explain what you're seeing here, along the x-axis, you see the phase at which the stimulus came with respect to the full 600 millisecond period, so 0 to 1. And so also in the 2-beat condition, this is the 600 milliseconds. So the two metronome tones here are the same. There shouldn't be any difference between these two. We wanted to be able to compare the two, so both were analyzed with respect to the 600 millisecond cycle. Here on the y-axis, you have the time of the response, normalized response time. So the 0 point here, again, is going to be, just as it was here, is going to be the last strong beat, the last 600 millisecond starting metronome tone, except now instead of a pure phase wrapped around a circle, always going up to 1, it's normalized to 1. So this is 600 milliseconds. We want to know really how long did it take. So there's a difference between the next metronome beat and the one after that and the one after that. So the next week beat, or did you have to wait a whole cycle for the week beat after that? So that displays this normalized response time in the vertical axis. And what you see very plainly is extremely modal responses. So what we can see is that even though they were told to respond as quickly as possible, they had really very little ability or limited ability to break out of that previous pattern of motion. They're going chugga, 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 chugga. And that response down bow is going to be pretty much an altered version of one of the places where one of their down bows would have been anyway. So hypothesis 1 very strongly confirmed. Interestingly, much more strongly than in the results of the papers we were modeling on. Here's a figure from one of Sternad's papers. Here we see 3 different ways of calculating the kind of meaningful point within an EMG burst. And you see the response, the distribution of responses across a phase here. And again, very strongly modal distribution, but unlike in our results, there's no portion of the response phase that's excluded from responses. Whereas in our data, you see these big, empty, almost empty gaps here. So much more strongly modal responses for our musicians. And I can talk a little bit more in the Q&A if people are curious about my guesses about why that might have been. Second hypothesis, that there would be entrainment between the previously established metronomic pulse and the responses in the 4-beat verbal condition. But the effects observed would be weaker than in the 2-beat and 4-beat conditions. This hypothesis formulated especially in light of second author Heather Rusevich's theory of entrained manual and speech systems, that there's a phase capture effects between when you talk with your hands while you're talking, there's phase capture between your hand motions and your speech. Interestingly, this hypothesis was not supported. You see the regression line here of the responses. The slope is 0.95. We found that not significantly different from 1. So essentially, this is simply a constant response time. So really no phase capture of the top response from what was going on with the body in the violin playing, I should say. And we also did some circular statistics. So we plotted those same data around the unit circle, and we found no significant difference between our data and a uniform circular distribution as confirmed by a Hermann-Rassens test for circular uniformity. Okay, third hypothesis, really the crux of things as far as focal impulse theory is concerned. So in the 4-beat condition, we predicted that the stronger beat would be a stronger phase attractor for the responses than the weaker beat. Okay, now let's go back to our data here. And now what I want to point out is that these gray boxes have been shaded in to allow you to compare the first half of the response, the first half of the period, with the second half. So you can imagine taking this rectangle and just shifting it up here. Now in the 2-beat condition, there really shouldn't be any difference. There's no reason to think there's any difference between one 300 millisecond period and the next, because there's no difference in the metronome tone. No reason to think performers are tracking this in any way. And indeed, you can see that if you kind of take this, shift it up there, it's pretty darn similar. There is a difference, however, in the 4-beat condition. Now observe that, very early in the cycle, if the stimulus comes in here, the very next downbeat, down bow, can be converted into a response halfway through the next cycle. But as it goes somewhat further, that's no longer possible. That down bow has to just be a regular one, and it's the strong beat coming up that gets to be the response. However, after that weak beat, you can go somewhat deeper. So it's longer that you're able to turn around quickly and turn that very next bow stroke, the very next down bow, into the response, if it's also a strong beat. So if it's a strong beat, you're able to turn around faster and make it a response compared to when that next down bow is going to be a weak beat. So the difference between this to that, transitioning to this, versus this thing transitioning to this, it's a later transition. And this led to our most robust results, statistically speaking, in the simple reaction time. So what was the time from stimulus to the interrupting signal until the response? There was a significant difference between the 4-beat condition and the 2-beat. In the verbal conditions, no difference between the 2-beat and the verbal. We did not find a difference in a significant difference in the number of elapsed modes from stimulus to response, which would have been a nice result to have, but that was not significant with the quantity of data we had. Again, we did circular statistics on this question, and based on the work of Madison in 2014, we expected that a deeper metrical hierarchy would correlate with better defined entrainment, so sharper modes. So we looked at the concentration of the response modes in the 4-beat and 2-beat conditions. We modeled this in a few different ways using circular statistical distributions, 3 ways. All 3 of them agreed that the 4-beat condition had more concentrated modes, narrower modes than the 2-beat condition, and in 2 of those tests, the p-values were very close to traditional thresholds for significance at 0.06 and 0.07. So in light of the statistical community's warnings about putting too much emphasis on bright line cutoffs, and in light of 2 different distributions, both coming so very close to traditional significance, we do hold that this is a fully significant result, that the modes were more narrowly concentrated in the 4-beat condition in comparison with the 2-beat condition. And then finally, hypothesis 4, any differences observed between the strong beat and weak beat response modes in the 4-beat condition would not be observed in the 4-beat verbal condition. Well, that was kind of trivially satisfied by the fact that the 4-beat condition really didn't show any modes at all. So I look forward to taking your questions. Thank you for allowing me to participate virtually. I look forward to talking with you momentarily for you and in a few weeks for me.